So, welcome to another episode of The Double Take. I'm Emily Carver, Head of Media at the Institute of Economic Affairs. This is the show where we tackle two of the biggest stories of the week. This week, I'm joined by Andy Mayer, who is an energy analyst at the Institute of Economic Affairs and also Chief Operating Officer. We'll be breaking down that energy security strategy that the government published this week, finally. And I'll be talking to Emma Webb, who is a prominent political and social commentator. If you enjoy this episode, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. So, one of the biggest stories of the week has been the government's long-awaited energy security strategy. This is intended to increase supply of energy, reduce our dependency on countries such as Russia, and hopefully reduce prices. Here with me to discuss this is Andy Mayer, Energy Analyst and Chief Operating Officer at the IEA. So you've been a little bit harsh about this strategy, I think it's fair to say. You've said that it's weak and that it won't do anything to reduce our bills, and it won't be that good for our domestic security really either. Why is that?
Well, if anything, Emily, I think I've been extremely kind. I mean, we need to remember that this government put themselves in this mess by executing their energy policy as a subset of net zero. So everything the government has been focused on for the last 2 years has been about reducing our emissions by an arbitrary political target nesting somewhere in 2050.
But is that not necessary? You accept as well, and most people at the IEA accept, that we need to decarbonise to essentially secure the future of our planet. How can net zero not therefore be the government's top priority when it's looking at energy policy?
Well, decarbonisation and net zero are two slightly different things. Decarbonisation, we all agree, is a really sensible long-term objective for the entire economy, getting down the levels of CO2 that are emitted from all fields of human activity such that we arrest and stop the process of global warming. That's a little bit different to saying, by this fixed date, January the 1st, 2050, the UK, which is responsible for about 1% of global emissions, will have decarbonised our entire economy, or at least done so on a net form, by that time, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing. And in energy policy terms, it's ignoring something that's been there from the start, which is this concept of the energy trilemma. That's trading off security of supply, which is the thing that stops the lights going out, affordability, can we actually pay the bills, and decarbonisation, or other environmental goals sometimes as well. And yeah, the government have said effectively the only thing that matters in that mix is net zero.
Yeah, so from my understanding, this new security strategy, the plan is to ramp up nuclear, ramp up onshore and onshore and offshore wind power. Also, potentially review into fracking. So that could potentially mean that we start drilling, which is something that you've advocated and called for. And then also to make it easier to explore oil in the North Sea. Sounds pretty good to me. You know, they're covering all the bases there, are they not?
Not really. So if we look at the most important part
Just a
first,
disaster.
we're in a gas supply crisis.
Yes.
That's why the prices are shooting up. And we're in a gas supply crisis because there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, and we're all returning from the pandemic. So demand is shooting up as other industries come on stream. And that's it. What we've done successfully over the years is throttle our own domestic supply. We had a moratorium on fracking in 2019 after messing around for 8 years pretending that we could get the regulations to a level where nothing unsafe could ever happen. And in the North Sea, the government has been deliberately advising the regulator to stop things happening, such that new fields like Cambo, for example, were blocked on spurious environmental grounds. Now, that's gone, and the government has said after the summer, there's going to be a new licensing round for new developments in the North Sea.
Is there no truth to the concerns over fracking, over the safety concerns? Because I've read and heard from you and others how these are very small tremors. You'd never stop another industry from going ahead, from growing, because of these safety concerns that are very minor. It seems I can't get my head around why it was ever essentially cancelled to begin with, if that is the case. Is it simply just the eco lobby campaigned so hard that no Conservative MP would touch it? Or was it simply they were concerned about being elected because people in rural communities, in those communities affected, just did not want fracking?
Well, it's definitely the second of those more than the first. I mean, most MPs are annoyed by extreme environmental activists. They're not particularly threatened by them. They're terrified of NIMBYs. Local residents associations saying, we don't oppose this in principle, is the normal argument, just not here. And which is a totally disingenuous argument. It essentially comes from people, usually approaching retirement, who've bought into a local area and are very happy with the idea that nothing will change around them for the rest of their days. Which is why we have a housing crisis, which is why it's very hard to build onshore wind, which is why it's very hard to build onshore solar, and so it goes on. So that argument is the one that's prevalent in the mind of Theresa May when she put the moratorium in place. The safety excuse made the Conservative government rather like the RMT or one of their regular strikes on safety on the London Underground. It's not genuine. The tremors associated with the industry are very similar to those associated with construction, with quarrying, with mining. And for those industries which are old and established, there are safety regulations in place. I mean, I could bore you with the detail. British Standard 5228, for example, which showed.
I don't know what that means.
Well, to put it in context, the tremor that took place in 2019, or was it 18, that got the entire industry banned, was half that of what is permitted as safe operations for a construction site. And that's nuts. That's the abuse of the precautionary principle, which the Institute of Economic Affairs has commented on previously. One of the reasons that Britain left the EU was trying to get past the habit of the European Union of using the precautionary principle to stop legal, safe, but potentially scary sounding activities from happening. So we are doing to ourselves now what we said we would leave the EU to stop.
So what can the government do then? If you were Energy Secretary, what can we do to bring down prices and at the same time decarbonise in the medium and long term?
Okay, so this year, nothing is going to affect prices bar finding alternative sources of gas and oil.
And so they could bring down the prices this year if they wanted.
It's not under their control. They've got to persuade OPEC, the oil producing nations, to increase supply. And so far, OPEC are saying no.
And that's the despotic regimes, Iran,
some. I mean, yeah,
Saudi Arabia, etc., etc.
Saudi Arabia is the big one. If you don't have Saudi on board, really nothing much is going to happen.
So really, there's no alternative to going cap in hand, as Keir Starmer said, to those regimes and asking, please turn on the taps a bit more.
Or negotiating with future trade partners as global Britain, as I'm sure the Prime Minister would say. I mean, let's be fair to them. That's the one thing they're doing right. They're trying to ensure that our security of supply is improved by improving trade links. So that's this year. The other thing they should be doing this year is deregulating. The moratorium's just got to go. This 3-month safety review is a nonsense. What it will come up with is probably predetermined by politics. If it comes and says there's no new technology that will reduce the risk of minor earth tremors, then we know they're not serious. If they say, well, actually, nothing much has changed, but we accept that the regulations we put in place were far too extreme, disproportionate, and inconsistent, then we know they're serious. Then we know that fracking can happen. But they've got to also then change the planning rules. We cannot have a situation where local areas can veto nationally important energy infrastructure. This is a difficult one for free marketeers because we quite like the idea of a lot of local consent and a lot of local control. But in reality, that's saying that people who own land have total control over the land that's next to them. That's not really property rights. We need to consult. We need to offer people realistic alternatives. But if you're the kind of local area that's saying no to nuclear, no to solar, no to wind, no to fracking, then really
and likely housing
and
likely housing too. Yeah. But I think it's good. At least the government. It's very difficult for the government to have to acknowledge that their policy of net zero, being committed to a very arbitrary target by an arbitrary date, perhaps has thrown our domestic security of supply under the bus to an extent. It appears that they are at least acknowledging that to a degree in terms of bringing back those words affordability, bringing back those words security, and going to those countries and, at least looking into fracking and opening up North Sea exploration. But will energy bills be any cheaper this time next year?
Well, let me just challenge what you've just said. So certainly the rhetoric has changed. And there were some green activists today moaning that they didn't see the word net zero anywhere in the government's press release. But if they'd gone to the report that was published yesterday on the new future supply operator, which was actually a huge announcement, the government has nationalised a part of the national grid responsible for ensuring that all this stuff fits together.
So this is the new body that is going to be set up to essentially add another layer of bureaucracy to look after the national grid, or is it replacing something?
It's a consolidation of bureaucracy and supposedly replacing private advice with independent public advice, which realistically means
I'm not sure many of our viewers will know the difference between those two things. Sounds like semantics.
Well, what it means is civil servants will rotate between Ofgem, BEIS, and the future supply operator, some of them going into industry and then coming back. So it'll be independent, but it will be independent, dominated by corporate influences and interests.
Right.
And at the top of their operating guidelines is net zero. It says that they have objectives to look at net zero, security of supply, and what they're calling efficiency rather than affordability, which is worrying in itself. But what that means is that when they have to come to make the difficult decisions, the trilemma, the trade-offs, they're going to look at that and say, well, we must hit our net zero target by 2050. We will look at the most affordable, secure ways of doing that. But if the data comes back and says this will put £500, £1,000 on bills, as is happening at the moment, their advice to government is going to be, you should do that. It won't be. This is far too expensive. You're going to cause huge damage to the United Kingdom economy. You're going to damage growth. And in fact, in the long term, you'll damage net zero and environmental targets because there's no prosperity.
Okay, so it's pretty much doom and gloom. So one final question. Will our bills be cheaper this time next year?
This time next year, possibly, because they're going to get a lot more expensive in autumn.
So moving on to a very different issue. This week, no-fault divorce came into action. It was introduced in England and Wales. This is the biggest shake-up of divorce law in 50 years. And essentially it puts an end to the blame game for couples who wish to split amicably. So previously, unless adultery, unreasonable behaviour or desertion could be proven, the only way out without an agreement of the spouse was to live apart for 5 years. So I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Webb, who is the nation's favourite political broadcaster and social commentator. Thanks for joining me.
The hyperbole. Good to be with you.
It's lovely to have you on my show, The Double Take, the second episode. So Emma, surely this is a good thing. We don't want women and men stuck in loveless marriages for longer than they need to, no?
And I think I have sympathy with some of the arguments that have been made, and in some of the media coverage of this, there have been personal profiles of people explaining why they believe that it's a good thing that this legislation is being introduced, and that they would have benefited from a no-fault divorce. One of the reasons that has been stated for that is that couples that would have otherwise separated amicably have had to lay the blame at someone's door, and that in doing so, that makes it much more difficult. It also means that under the current circumstances, if you don't lay blame at someone's door, then you have to live separated for 5 years before you can be legally divorced. And there are many people who have said that traps them for an extra 5 years in a loveless marriage, that might be, for example, someone's fertile years. And that it creates hostility between the couple that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And particularly if children are involved, you can see how that might be a good thing and be sympathetic towards it. But I think that, to be devil's advocate, and I think in many ways I lean in this direction myself, is that marriage is supposed to be a sacred institution. It's one of the most fundamental institutions within society. It's one of the building blocks of society. And when you enter into a marriage, it's not just a contractual thing. And, all contracts are supposed to be difficult to get out of. That's why they're contracts. But it's also a decision to take sacred vows. And those sacred vows are supposed to be for life. And that's not something that you enter into lightly. And so I think the concern is that with no-fault divorce, that marriages should be something that are difficult to get out of, that the institution of marriage will be undercut and eroded by this, that it could lead to an increase in the already high divorce rates, and then actually, given that both couples entered into those sacred vows for a lifelong commitment, that living separated from each other for 5 years isn't actually that burdensome. And I obviously, as I say, I sympathize with people's plight, but given that it was supposed to be a lifelong vow, and one of the people in that marriage may have taken those vows seriously when the other didn't, that actually that is an unreasonable burden to place on people, and that marriage, in order to protect the institution itself, should be something that it isn't easy to simply walk away from. Otherwise, it's the same as any other kind of partnership.
But just on that point, why should this institution be held up so high? I mean, as you said it was a sacred institution. For most people, it isn't. For a lot of people, it doesn't mean anything religious anymore. Does the state even need to be involved in marriage at this stage? And surely it should not be making it more difficult for people to split. I would argue that an unhappy marriage also undermines the institution of marriage, not just making it a harder contract, an easier contract to break.
I think that our understanding of marriage over the years, I was going to say over the last decade, but probably actually since the 1960s, has obviously changed a lot. And that's partly because of the decline in religion. And there has been a decline in marriages as well, we should remember. And there are other forms of union that we have now, like civil partnerships. And many people just simply choose not to get married. But originally, marriage was a sacrament. It was something that was entered into through the church, and it had all of the religious obligations attached to that. And it was viewed as two people becoming of one flesh, as a sacred vow. And obviously, as religion has declined in the UK, that understanding has changed. And there have been some people who've said, for example, that they entered into their marriage and didn't even understand, contractually speaking, never mind the sacred vow aspect of it, they didn't understand the seriousness of that commitment, and then ended up getting divorced. So I think that it's a fair point to make, that marriage isn't understood in that way anymore. But I think it's important to protect that institution, because it is one of the building blocks of social cohesion. It is
I believe in marriage. I think that it's probably the best and most secure way to raise children. But should the state really be preferencing one way of living over another? We see tax breaks, okay, they're not very big, they're not that significant for married couples. What about those people who either have chosen not to get married, or who would like to get married but simply haven't found anyone? Do you really think that the government should be, or do you agree that the government should be using the tax system or using other means to promote one lifestyle over another?
Well, there are two aspects of this. I think one of them is that that there are different types of unions that are available to people now. As I mentioned, civil partnerships. Many people choose not to get married. Many people don't want to enter into those contractual obligations that come along with marriage, regardless of any tax benefits. There are other countries around the world that give, including Hungary as an example, to pick on one country that's been in the news recently, that has far more far-reaching pro-family policies than we do here in the UK. And I know that this is an argument that many libertarians will disagree with, but I think policies and social policies always encourage one kind of behavior over another. And if you believe in the importance of family to society, and particularly the importance of, because there is a very good argument for the fact that families being the primary one of the primary building blocks of a society is actually the way that you secure freedom within a society, that there's a libertarian argument to be made for that, and that if you believe that is the case, then encouraging families and making life easier for people to have families, because let's remember that not just marriage but also children that come along with marriage that is a very difficult thing to enter into. And so encouraging people to do that for the sake of the stability and cohesion of society, I think that there's a very good argument for that. And in that respect, even though we do have a variety of different unions that are available to people now in modern Britain, that marriage is still a distinctive thing, and it's important to protect that. And I think that whether you understand the sanctity of marriage from a religious perspective, and many people still talk about the sanctity of marriage from a secular perspective, I think that the importance of the institution of marriage is something that is still widely recognized, and it's very important to protect the integrity of that.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm split. I'm torn because on the one hand, I think that marriage has been proven time and time again to be the best way of raising a family and provide stability in that way. But on the other hand, I'm not sure I like the idea of the government preferencing one way of living over another and essentially getting involved in what should be, in my view, more of a private matter. But moving on to something that I know you're very interested in as well, and it's something I've been talking about this week on various channels. It's the discussion about what is a woman, the difficulty our politicians have been having in describing what is a woman. We've now seen that a campaign has been launched, I think, with the Daily Mail's backing last Friday, and that's three quite famous now feminists who've launched it, including Maya Forstater, who of course was lost her job as a result of saying biology exists, or that a man can't change into a woman or change their sex. I think it was the offending remarks. What do you make of this? Do you think this is going to put pressure on politicians? Of course, Boris Johnson's already come out and, set things out as, clear as day. So what do you think?
I think you've already said it, Emily. It's quite clear that this has worked because the grassroots support has already been so effective. We've seen over the last couple of weeks particularly, but over the last, say, 2 months, mounting pressure on politicians to say what a woman is. And it started with Labour MPs, people like Annalisa Dodds on Woman's Hour, being capable of defining what a woman is on International Women's Day. And that led to the question becoming a kind of gotcha that every politician was being asked. And so these, I think, extremely courageous women from 3 different organisations have come together to pile pressure on political candidates during local elections with the slogan, if you respect my sex if you want my ex. And that has obviously been extremely effective, particularly in the last couple of weeks, while the pressure's been mounting with really prominent figures like J.K. Rowling coming out in support of the campaign. And particularly, I think, because of the row around women's sports, which has made the issue far more mainstream.
Yes, it's interesting how it takes sports to mobilise public interest.
Yeah, I think many people will have who would have been unaware of the ins and outs of this issue, that had been, mostly online for a small group of people who have been described as being gender critical feminists, but they just holds the general public's view on sex, as opposed to radical gender ideology that groups like Stonewall push. The issue around women's sports, because it is so blatantly obvious how unfair the situation is, has made the issues more mainstream. So we've seen sports personalities, Olympians, writing to the Cyclist Union International, I think it's called, basically asking them to reassess their position on trans.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is an example of politics working quite well, democracy working quite well, insofar as you've had an activist lobby, in the case of the trans activists, mobilising support among politicians, and they've taken on some of their dogma and their ideology. And then people have, risen up on the other side and pointed out the flaws in both the legislation and also the weakness of some of our politicians in terms of talking about the difference between sex and gender and all the issues that relate to that. And perhaps this is just the dial swinging back in the other direction, and that this will come to a solution. Or do you think that's wishful thinking? Do you think our institutions are still captured by this transgender ideological dogma?
I think that the trans I don't want to call them trans rights lobbyists, because I think that doesn't do justice to what they are. They are lobbyists who are pushing a radical gender ideology that
Yes, it's not people who are just looking out for the rights of transgender people. We all agree that trans people should be able to live their lives as freely as possible. It's just that conflict between women's rights and transgender rights.
Even the women who are campaigning for same-sex spaces, for sex-based rights, which are, sex, the recognition of sex underpins women's rights, full stop. So they are, in the spirit of the suffragettes, very much campaigning for women's rights, but that is not, so they often get called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, but they are not campaigning to the exclusion of the equality of trans people under the law. That is a misrepresentation that seems to be coming primarily from those radical activists who have a radical gender, who are pushing a radical gender ideology. But I think that they have had so much more of a time advantage in the sense that they've been going for a very long time, lobbying in this way, quite quietly at first. Stonewall, for example, have captured many institutions, and I think that's something that will take a very, very long time to undo. But what we've seen now, because as with the case of women's sports, but other issues as well, like women's prisons and domestic abuse hubs, I guess you would say, shelters, that women are now so concerned about this, and that more awareness is increasing around the issue, women are starting to mobilize because they've realized that their sex-based rights are, or our sex-based rights are under threat from this ideology. And it's interesting because now the momentum behind this seems to be building at such a rapid speed, and public awareness through things like sport has been increasing more and more, and people are becoming very aware of this, that it has become a political hinge issue. And Boris Johnson, possibly in a cynical way, if you wanted to be cynical, has made the political decision to come out and say that biological men should not be competing in women's sports. And that just goes to show that grassroots activism in what is a relatively short period of time has actually had a huge effect. And that simply asking politicians the question over and over again to the point of absurdity is working in exposing the ideology that many of them have taken on, and also by increasing the costs on the other side, because the costs have always been associated with people who transgress that radical gender ideology. Now there is a cost associated with not being able to say that a woman is a woman.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I think this all comes down to, it's not just the ideology, it's the fact that the government has such messy legislation that sits uncomfortably together, the Gender Recognition Act and the Equalities Acts, which, if they don't contradict, they certainly don't sit side by side very comfortably, which has caused these issues, which is why when Keir Starmer said, trans women are women, technically he was correct under the law if you take the Gender Recognition Act in its conclusions. So, it's been difficult for these politicians. It's nice to see Boris Johnson come out and be straightforward and have a little bit of common sense. He acknowledged it's a controversial issue. It'll be interesting to see where this subject goes now, but I don't think politicians will get away with stumbling over what is a woman for very much longer. So thank you so much for joining me, Emma. That's Emma Webb, social and political commentator and broadcaster. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Double Take.
Thank you for having me.
So that was this week's episode of The Double Take with me, Emily Carver. If you enjoyed this episode, please do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and please leave a comment below letting me know what you think and what you'd like to hear us talk about. Thanks for watching.